Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Humans and Wildlife Show. I'm Georgia Auteri, and with us is my co host, Christian Zase. Christian, what are we going to talk about today?
Hi, Georgia. Thank you. And this is another day. So another week has passed. It goes so quickly. Today, I have my eagle friend and eagle biologist, David Hancock from the Hancock Wildlife Foundation. And we're going to go into the history of the eagles. Actually, a story that started off quite negative and went quite positive. So, without further ado, David, let's get going.
Well, that's fine. I want to be, because I'm now 83, I can afford to be reflective. And I was brought up with to kind of a real jolt here, just very, very recently. And that jolt was because a lady contacted me about a project we were doing on Vancouver Island. In fact, French Creek on Vancouver Island, where we were promoting building an eagle's nest and trying to promote that this whole area, which had been slated for a housing development at the estuary of the French Creek River, become an eagle preserve.
Right.
And she saw the interview I did at the time on the news, and she was just so reminded of her past. And I, at the age of 13, had started to work for her family. Her husband and his brother ran a big gravel company, produced cement and gravel. And they lived literally next door to us. And the gravel pit was very close. And I got a job working for Joyce Butler's husband. He did the management of the whole gravel pit, but particularly he did the blasting,
Right.
to bring down the cliffs and get the gravel, and he did all the loading of the trucks and stuff. Well, I was right there, and every night after school, I learned how to go down and dig a hole 18 feet into the side of the cliff,
Wow.
fill it full of dynamite, and blow this thing down, because that would make the gravel for the next day's gravel trucks. So at 13, I became a powder monkey, they called it. And I did that all through my schooling in order to make extra money after school. Well, I also grew up because I had to go through Joyce's yard every day to go to school or to join my friends. And so I got to meet her and her daughters. Well, unbelievably, I'm now 83. I don't dare suggest what Joyce must be, but she is just as spry as anything. I phoned her because she'd asked her daughter to call me and phone her, and I did. And that lady has very kindly, and I won't say how many dollars, but a very, very sizable donation to the French Creek Save the Estuary Society for producing our bald eagle reserve on Vancouver
Well,
Island.
congratulations.
So it's amazing how things, well, that's damn near 70 years ago.
So how old is she now?
Well, that's the question that I don't dare ask, because I did talk to her, and she's just as sharp as anything. She's still running several companies. So this is the kind of thing that gives us who are been fighting conservation issues all our life and have a lot to be depressed about, a great amount to be depressed about. But every once in a while, one of these good things comes to the fore, and that's one of them.
That's
and I want
amazing.
to build on to several of those today, but this is one from 70 years ago that just has come back and has paid another dividend. And that's, I think, what a lot of us have to do. We have to invest in the what is common sense saving of our earth, because some years later it's going to pay off. And that's, of course, what your program is all about. It's about people and wildlife, and without us making that investment, it's simply not going to survive.
Well, that's a very positive note. So let's go back in history now. And Georgia, please feel free to jump in. You're a little bit of a disadvantage because I'm sitting right next to David. So, so just jump in. But
I'll raise my hand.
Just jump right in. Yeah, just jump right in. Okay. So
yeah, you may go to the washroom, Georgia. Oh, that's not the symbol. Sorry.
So just, yeah, as an overview, or for those who are kind of tuning in a little bit later here, the theme of today's show is that you've been working in conservation for a long time, and you have seen, you've had the benefit of seeing things kind of unfold over time. And so you have several stories of the positive changes you've seen over time that you can share with us today, sort of like, that our actions, our conservation actions, can actually have an effect over time, which is wonderful news, because it seems so hopeless sometimes.
It does. Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
So,
So what is the unifying theme for these stories? They're all to do with raptors primarily, is that correct?
well, I guess I had a particular interest in raptors. Not, we moved out to a farm when I was 11, and when I was 12, in the spring of 12, I caught a hawk when I was 12, and I had watched a gentleman come get out of his car, get a dog out, then get a falcon out of his car and fly it, and he was a falconer. Of course, at 12, I didn't even know what falconry was, and I'm laying in a flower bed trying to catch pigeons, and I'm watching what this man did with this hawk and what the hawk did with him. And at the end of watching him for nearly an hour, I got up and I ran up to the car where he was and started to talk to him. And I told him about how, well, I was interested in birds. I had pigeons and I had quail, and I had a trap in the little local gully beside the Butler Brothers gravel pit where I was catching quail. And after I described all this to him, he said, "Oh, well, if you just did this, 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 and bent that trap the way I'm suggesting, you might catch a hawk." Well, on the way home from talking to him, I went and bent my trap in a certain way. And would you believe that night I caught a hawk that very night? And so my father, when he got home, and he had to figure out who this gentleman was, because I didn't remember who he was. And he had to phone all around to find out about this gentleman and how he would help me deal with this live bird that I'm still clutching by the legs. And so that night, I learned how to put jesses on the bird's legs and got an introduction to how to train it. And that became my introduction to falconry and birds of prey, which to a large extent have indeed directed my life ever since, because I became a birds of prey biologist, as most of you know. And if it wasn't with birds of prey, I was dealing with orcas and various things. So predators have been a great driving force in my life.
So would you say that your interest started just because you thought like hawks were cool, or birds were cool and stuff, but the conservation aspect kind of came later, after, your initial hook was like the animals are cool, and then you realized, wait, we have to do this like conservation stuff to help them out?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, at 12, 13, the concepts of conservation aren't yet even concepts in your brain. But because this gentleman, Frank Beebe, the one who taught me how to undertake falconry, he worked at the Provincial Museum in Victoria. And he wasn't a biologist, he was the artist. But all the biologists, whether you're a fish biologist, a bird, a mammal, an insect biologist, undersea biologist, or the botanist, they all depended on my friend, Frank Beebe, for his photographic memory. And he was the only one in the entire museum complex who read every single scientific journal that came into the museum. So anytime anybody in any discipline had to publish a book or a paper, they had to go to Frank. Well, they didn't have to, but they would willingly go to Frank, and he would tell them where all the literature was. And he did literally, I think, 75 different books for the museum with all the illustrations. He was an incredibly fast artist. We didn't, I guess, bring any today, but I commissioned him later on in life when I became a publisher to do 40 big paintings of birds of prey of the world for me. And every one of these, he did one a night. And they're very elaborate, detailed paintings. He had that ability without references to be able to have memorized where every feather and color bar and so on was. Maybe he'd get the odd feather from the museum collection to verify things, but he just had this ability to capture things in the middle of flight and in action. And I commissioned 40 paintings of every different major raptor around the world with a prey of that country's species. So that was my introduction to the wildlife and the exciting part of it. But I
Yeah.
grew up to a large extent over the next 10 years in the basement of the Provincial Museum with their great collections. And as the associate people, the bird biologist, the mammal biologist, the fish biologist, the insect biologist, the botanist, the anthropologist, they were all there. And they indeed are what generated my broad interest in becoming an ecologist and eventually an ornithologist. But these were
Yeah,
the
you've
people.
you've highlighted something really nice there, which is how, all these different things can bring people into being interested about nature or conservation. And you talk about the illustration, the wildlife illustration and scientific illustration. And Christian and I are actually doing a brief illustration project tomorrow. Christian, if I could get you to talk about that for just a second, since we have a good opportunity to interject it here.
Yeah, it's actually something. This is the wonderful thing. Thank you, Georgia, about HAPS, that you meet really interdisciplinary or cross-disciplinary experts. And tomorrow, actually, a few weeks ago, I was approached by, I think, some native artists, and they saw my eagle pictures. A lot of the eagle
Yeah,
photographs, and they would like to draw or to paint them. And that's what we're going to do tomorrow. I'll put the link actually of this so you can join. I'm just going to look for the link. In the meantime, just go on, please.
Yeah, so I'm curious to hear, David, what would you say? I know you have a lot of stories to share with us today, but what would you say, like, can you pick even one story where you've seen it's had the biggest impact on you, where you've been like, wow, that's like a conservation outcome I never would have expected? What would you say your top story is?
Mhm.
never would have expected. Well, because I grew up eh, dealing with this wildlife from a very young age, I was dealing with the wildlife in a real sense. By the time I was 14, I already had been the recipient of dozens and dozens of different hawks, falcons, eagles. I started to get given from the Fish and Wildlife branch bears that were abandoned, cougars that were abandoned, seabirds and sea ducks that were covered with oil, and I had to recover them. So, from a very early on, my mother, and I can't, dear bless her, I can't leave her out of the story, because when you get all these animals dumped on your doorstep, a lot of it, because you're going to school or whatever, becomes mom's challenge. And so mom always encouraged me to try to save these animals. And so I grew up in this environment of rescuing animals, whether they were ducks from being covered with oil, or whether they were a bear. The mother had been washed down a mountainside or in the snow slide, and there were the cubs sitting exposed, and they were rescued. And where do they go? Well, if they're on Vancouver Island, they came to me. If they're on the mainland, they went to Alan Best at the Vancouver Zoo. There were no other rehabbers in the province at the time. So we had just dozens and dozens of creatures around our place, and that carried on
This is
right
something
through
I'm
university.
actually curious about. Has there been like an increase in wildlife rehab that you've seen in your lifetime? Like, are more people doing wildlife rehab than there used to be?
Oh, absolutely. It wasn't even formalized. I mean, in my day, the Fish and Wildlife branch would get the calls, and the common solution was just to have to put the animal down. They might give it to a local zoo, but if it wasn't well, the zoo didn't have the time and the resources. And after you had three bears, cubs, what do you do with the 5, 6, 7, and 8? You put them down. And that was what happened in those days. And the same thing with hawks and eagles that got into difficulty. They were just put down. And we started this whole trend locally. And Alan Best at the zoo, and I over on the island, just in my backyard, and it eventually became my research center. Um, we would take whatever animal was in challenge somehow, and try to get it back, able to go back into the wild. So yeah, it's evolved. Now it's a very formalized process. There are people all over the world, not just locally, all over the world with very organized rehabilitation centers. Some of them, like in Vancouver here, we have the whole Northwest largest rehabilitation center. It's called OWL, and they just do an incredible job. I mean, up to last week, I think they had 68 eagles already. In a 3-4 week period, they got 64 merlins sent in. They just deal with birds of prey. There's other nearby rehabilitation centers that deal with deer and bear cubs, and there's other ones that deal with crows and ducks and passerine birds. There's huge wildlife resources in this lower mainland of British Columbia where we live, and of course they're always getting into difficulties. They're either falling out of nests, which was something that was on an unprecedented scale this past year with the high heat temperatures. Eagles were just chicks were jumping out of the nest just because they were cooking in the nest, and the same with a lot of other bird species. So the rehabilitators have done marvelous job in saving birds and animals. And I will add on their behalf, for years, many biologists considered this to be a kind of non contributory force for conservation. Well, that's totally absurd nonsense. They are making an incredible effort. We started well, for 40 years now, I've been really keeping detailed records, and particularly 28 years in the valley here. And I've had time after time where I'm seeing birds that have been rehabilitated and they've got a marker on them, and they're out now 6, 7, 8 years later, and they're breeding in the wild again. So the rehabilitators did an enormous job in getting animals past the difficult part of their life back as functioning individuals in the wild environment. And you see that around all the time because these rehabilitated birds are all breeding in the wild again, or many of them are. So the contribution that they're making is quite a conservation contribution.
Well,
Yeah,
David,
that's a really good point that you bring up, David. And certainly I've heard those same criticisms that, it's kind of wildlife rehabilitation is not really doing that much good. It's kind of for the bleeding hearts and more that than a scientific endeavor that actually makes an impact. But I actually recently saw as well a scientific study where they, compared, I will have to find it. I think they were looking at turtles, but they compared areas where there was a lot of wildlife rehab versus areas where they weren't. And they saw that the rehab of these turtles did actually make a difference. These are like freshwater turtles. But I think, yeah, it also, there's different factors. It depends on the species and stuff too. But I mean, it, not only is it directly helping the animals, but it's also increasing, the public's awareness of these animals in many cases. I just want to jump back quickly because you mentioned, with this horrible heat wave out there, chicks overheating and falling out of the nest and stuff like that. As I understand it, you used to do quite a bit of bald eagle nest monitoring. Is that correct? Can you tell us a little bit about those experiences of yours?
Well, I still do a lot of bald
Oh,
eagle monitoring. In fact, we
my mistake.
pioneered putting cameras in eagles' nests 16, 17 years ago now. And that is, of course, the ultimate in monitoring eagle nests because you've got 24/7 day and night. You've got a camera telling you what eagles do intimately in their nest in raising their young, what kind of food they really eat, how many hours it takes to incubate the egg, and what is the actual number of days between hatching and actually finally fledging and so on. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that observations are wonderful. They're the basis of scientific investigation. But boy, once you can record a lot of these things on a camera and then begin to analyze this over time, it's quite an incredible detailed picture you begin to develop about how eagles live, how they make their living, and how they defend themselves. I mean, one simple story about this is most of us who watched eagles intimately, or it doesn't matter what it is, what kind of wildlife, basically come dark, you folded up your binoculars or your telescope and went home. because you couldn't see any longer. Well, all our cameras have infrared lights on them. And so all of a sudden, wow, eagles have a nightlife as well. And it turns out that not only do they get hit on the head sometimes at night by a horned owl? They get visited. Some raccoon comes climbing up the tree and challenging them over the nest site, usually unsuccessfully in the sense of the eagles can hold their own. But and there's another whole culture of eagles, and that is in the nest, the huge nest structure, 6, 8, 10 feet across, and maybe 2, 3, 4, 6 feet deep, is also the home of many other birds, starlings, sparrows, but also mice live in this great nest. And so at night, these mice come out and they're running all over the eagles. So, I mean, there's all sorts of things that we didn't anticipate about the nightlife of eagles that's given us this greater appreciation of their life.
So are the mice, are they coming into the nest and eating like the scraps of food that's given to eagle chicks or?
They could be doing that in part, but eagle nest, you see, once a big nest, I mean, some of these nests are 10, 12 feet across. They'll hold 10 kids. You know, if you could hold a big party for 10 children in an eagle's nest, some of them. Some of them are only maybe 5.5 feet across. They're quite small. But there's a lot of things grow in an eagle's nest. When that nest has been added to year after year by a whole bunch of branches and mosses and lichens, it becomes a duff layer, just like the ground does, and it's decaying, and it produces a soil layer in the nest, just like the ground produces a soil layer. And so things grow. And if an eagle's nest is abandoned, all of a sudden the next season, instead of it being knocked down, if there was a pair of eagles there, if the year goes by with no eagles in it, all of a sudden there may be 2.5, 3 feet of grasses growing in this eagle's. Well, all those grasses are also producing seeds. And seeds are the basic food for mice. So you see, there's a subculture and a micro environment in the eagle nest that not only is the nesting structure for eagles, but it's also a feeding substrate for a lot of mice. And burrowing into the sides can be starlings and sparrows and various other things. So it is the nest is a living structure of a whole bunch of different interrelated creatures.
I see, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'm curious, while we're talking about nests here, so in at least in the United States, there's what, our bald eagle crash was largely due to, from what I understand, a use of this chemical called DDT, right, which was an insecticide, and it got, the chemical got into the ecosystem and it caused the eagle's eggs to be so thin that when they would sit on them, they would crack and break, because the eggs were too thin. So is that, I guess I don't know, like in Canada, did you have similar problems? Was there like all this DDT use and then recovery of the eagles after it was banned, or yeah, did that problem ever exist?
Well, you are giving the standard reply about the crash of eagles, and it's quite true, and I don't want to take away from that. But
But it's not the full story, and
but
you're going
it
to tell us the
definitely
full
is
story.
not the full story. And the full story is that eagles are fish eaters. They evolved from vultures and they learned how to catch fish after they were vultures. So for half the year, bald eagles are active predators eating fish. Now, because they eat fish, which live in water, rivers, creeks, lakes, oceans, they're directly competing with us, with people. And when we started to invade the North American continent, I mean, I say we, the European culture, we started to cut down all the trees that were where we were, which was we were along the rivers and the lakes and the streams and the ocean. So we first cut down all the great trees and used them for lumber or to get them out of the damn road because they were blocking our view or where we wanted to put an industry. So that was the great homes. of eagles because they lived along the rivers, and it was along the rivers with the roots of those great trees into the ground where they could draw up water that were the big trees. They border the rivers or the lakes or the coast. And the result was humans, as they intruded into North America and worked their way across in the 15, 16, 17, 18, 1900s, we were already setting up a circumstance which was pretty devastating to eagles. We took away their nest trees, and we're still doing it. Then in 1946, when they developed pesticides, and particularly DDT, for the war effort, and it was used as to get rid of lice. That was really its main use, to get rid of lice off people in the trenches. And so, but then it became a pesticide for getting rid of mosquitoes. And so it was that use of the of DDT, killing mosquitoes, that getting into the ecosystem, that caused this chain reaction where once the poison got into the land, it's affecting the insects. The insects are killing off the small birds, and the small birds, as they get incapacitated, they're picked up by the predators, the Cooper's hawks and the eagles and stuff, and they accumulated this poison. And that is what resulted ultimately in the really big crash in the eastern states of the eagle population. But I have to add, when I started to get involved in the 50s in eagles, one of the first things I did was to climb trees and collect several eggs for the Canadian Wildlife Service, who wanted to know, was the same problem prevalent in our western eagles as it was in the eastern eagles, and the eagles not just in the east, but specifically in the agricultural areas of the Mississippi Valley, because that's where the DDT was going on in huge, huge quantity. Well, all those first eggs that I collected and sent in, they all came back with almost no pesticide residue. And quite logically, we did not put a lot of pesticides yet on our land. And in our area here, we didn't even really have an agricultural industry. I mean, we grew some wheat and hay for a cow industry, but we didn't grow big, huge crops. So your answer is really quite simple. Yes, pesticides were the really final straw for a while in eagles back, but it was an eastern challenge which only recently has now become a western challenge. And now the Pacific Ocean, particularly starting with California and now up here, the Pacific Ocean is contaminated. I mean, I was going to say when you went to school, but you're just a young chickie poo. I'm sorry to say that. I don't mean to be sexist or what, or pull being an oldie on you, but I mean, there's quite a difference. When I went to school, I was taught that there were 7 oceans in the world. 7 oceans. Well, that was a total nonsense. There's one damn ocean in the world. And when they dump contaminants in the Thames River or in the Amazon, it ends up in the Salish Sea outside my door about 11 to 13 years later. So it's not one ocean, and not 11 oceans or 7 oceans with a whole bunch of little. It's one interrelated body of water which is circulating. And so if you contaminate one part, that contamination goes worldwide. And that's a
Yeah,
really
all the
big
ocean
problem.
waters all the water eventually, mixes to some degree at some
Exactly. And
level.
we
Yeah,
now
we're
have a
certainly seeing
polluted
that.
ocean, which we didn't
Yeah.
used to have.
David, I'm gonna jump back just for a second because Marie in the comments has a really good question that I was wondering as well, which is, she asks, David, how do you see the stability of the eagle population today? And I think I was also particularly curious because in the East, our eagle, at least in the Eastern United States, our eagle population has certainly rebounded. So in the West, are they sort of still declining or just rebounding at a slower rate? Or
No, they rebounded here
okay.
really well. I mean, we still had thousands of eagles here all the time that they had the depression of eagles in the eastern states. We still had probably 40,000 pairs nesting in British Columbia. and probably more eagles in Alaska. So we still had a great number of eagles. Historically, our challenge has been different. And this is the story I know that Christian wanted me to tell
That's
you
it. That's it. So I don't have to ask
as
any
kind of an
questions.
introduction. So we'll
Okay.
now begin the
Yeah.
show.
Okay. Okay. Go ahead. I don't have to ask anything. Go.
when I when I was 14, 15, had eagles and hawks. I was training them for hunting. I was so enamored by the ability of falcons and eagles to fly. I said I had to learn to fly. Well, I can't do it by flapping my wings. I had to go and take pilot lessons. Well, fortunately, the same Mr. Butler, who I started the program on, he also had an airplane. And so I used to go and wash his airplanes, and he would take me, both the Butlers, both brothers, Tom and Claude, both had airplanes. And their airstrip was next door to my place on the other side of my house. So if I wanted to go for a flight, I just went up and washed an airplane. Then I'd get taken up on a flight somewhere. And of course, if you're a pilot and you own an airplane, you want to show the young kid how to fly. And so by the time I was 14, I was flying all over the place with them. By 15, I had signed up, taken all my courses to become a pilot, and was logging the time to get my license. Now, I knew I wouldn't be given a license until I was 16. But by the time I was well into 15, I'd put all the time in. And like most people, when they do flying, they go around and do lazy big circles in the sky and practice. That wasn't my style. I went down and because I already was plotting where all the eagle nests were, I used the airplane to go and fly around all the Gulf Islands, which are the Canadian islands off Victoria, and count where all the eagle nests were. And I located over 100 of them when I was 15 from the airplane. And then, now this
So
is
real quick, were you doing this on your own? Like you were just like, I just want to know where all the eagle nests were, or were
yeah,
you like giving the information to someone?
no, I was doing it on my own. And but I'm having to log the time for my license. You see, you have to put in so many hours. So my hours, instead of just doing lazy circles, was to count where eagle nests. That was much more fun. Besides, flying at 20 feet above the trees is much more exciting than flying at 5,000 feet. So other than doing all the shorelines of all the Gulf Islands off Victoria, it was nothing to fly across the border, because some of the islands, still only a quarter mile away, were American islands because we're right on the border boundary. And so I surveyed all the American islands. Nobody complained about flying from one country to the other in those days. Well, at 15, I came to the conclusion Canada has a pair of active eagle nests every mile of shoreline. There wasn't a single pair of active eagles nesting in Washington state. Not one single pair. Well, why? It's the same ecology. That you can't tell the difference in the ecology of the land on one side of the border than the other. It's just a fake line that we put through to divide America from Canada. But there were no active nests on the American side. Well, when I got my 16th birthday, not only did I get a pilot's license, but I also got a driver's license. I'd already been driving trucks for the Butler Brothers organization for some years on the road, but we don't talk about that. But I finally got my dad's car, and I went across to the mainland, to Blaine, Washington, which is the little town just across from where in fact, my property is on the border of Blaine, Washington. I live on the Canadian side, but 10 feet away is the American border, and that's Blaine, Washington. Down on the docks in Blaine, Washington, I came over on the ferry and went there, is one of the big Alaska fishing wintering villages. The fishermen that fish all summer in Alaska, most of them don't want to live in Alaska. They drive their boats down the coast, and they winter in Washington state at these little fishing ports along the coast. Blaine is one of the biggest ports for fishing boats. And on the back of every boat I found on that 16th birthday, in fact, it was April the 4th that I came over and did this, of
Wait, I have to
1952.
clarify real quick. So your first came your love of eagles. We had a question from Gentleman Ghost about that. First came your love of eagles, and then which came next, your driver's license or your pilot's license?
I got them both the same day.
Oh wow, it's really at the
I got
same
them on
time.
my
That
I
is
got them on my
incredible.
birthday because I'd already put the time in for my pilot's license, and I already knew how to drive it. I'll transgress. I don't know if Joyce Butler will ever get to hear this interview, but when I was 15, Claude and her husband, Tom Butler, assembled all the 15 drivers for the gravel trucks and the cement trucks, all of the gravel pit one day, because they had just got in the biggest, newest, fanciest Hydromatic. It was the first vehicle that was, and it had on it the biggest cement mixer they had in the entire company. And they lined all the drivers up, and I just was there in the pit working that day. And Claude decided that he would pick out the driver who was going to go on the road that summer with this new truck, and he picked me as the safest driver. I didn't
And
have
the
the heart.
youngest. And the
Well,
youngest.
I didn't have the heart to tell him I was 15. I didn't have a driver's license, but I was able to drive that first summer that biggest truck that they had, as a driving a cement truck. So I've been driving for a long time, a long time. Not that some of my friends think that, but anyway, the bottom line was I had, when I became 16, I got my driver's license and my pilot's license literally on the same day.
Well, David, let's go now to the reason that you just mentioned. So you were
Yes.
amazing. You were flying along all the, the islands there. You saw what's going on in the States, and you flew over Pacific Northwest in Canada. And now let's get to the topic now,
Right.
About the bounty, the reason, and also the please experience. Please tell us not only about the bounty on eagles. Tell us also a bit about your experience with the orcas and the seals and other things.
Well, okay. So now I'm in Blaine. I'm on April the 4th. I have 4 days into my birthday. April the 1st is my birthday. And so I get down on the first dock and the first boat, and there on the back of the boat is a white bucket about this big. And it's got about 9 legs. It seems to be there was one missing, if I remember. And all the boats had little white buckets. It was the last year. They hadn't been informed yet. The bounty had just ended, but nobody had bothered telling the fishermen this. So the legs that they were shooting and cutting off, the legs they were cutting off the eagles were going into these buckets, because when they got to Alaska, they'd get $2 as a bounty for every pair of legs. So there was the answer. The American fishermen had an incredible incentive to kill eagles in order to cut their legs off for $2. Because if you could fill that bucket with legs at $2 each a pair, that would pay for your whole gas bill all the way to Alaska. You got to remember, gasoline was 24 cents a gallon in those days.
So to be clear, could any fisher people cash in? I guess they were probably all fishermen back then. Could anyone, Canadian or US, cash in on this bounty if they happened to be going by Alaska, or it was like just mainly the US people that were able to use it?
A dislike for predators was kind of a universal worldwide concept, but it was only Alaska. And there were some Eastern Canadian provinces that paid a bounty. I don't even remember which one. British Columbia did not pay a bounty on eagles. So the fishermen all winter would shoot eagles in and around Washington State, because that's where they had to go down and check their boat every day to see that it wasn't filling up with water, and if they could shoot enough eagles. This is why when I started to do my surveys, even into the 60s, and flying the entire area again, counting eagles, there was still no eagles yet breeding in the Fraser Valley. I had 3 pairs in downtown Vancouver breeding. None over toward the American border. They had literally shot all the breeding eagles to cut their legs off and claim the bounty when they got to Alaska. So
you mentioned this kind of general dislike of predators and people back then being really kind of a bit overly paranoid, I would say, to be modest,
To
overly
be modest,
paranoid
yes.
about predators eating all their fish or all their livestock. Christian shared a piece with me before this about people even thought that eagles would eat like their baby calves or something like that.
Well, you can see it today. I don't know if you've watched television, but you can see eagles carrying off cows. Some of them are several hundred-pound cows,
This
maybe
is
That's
six,
true.
sarcasm
eight hundred
for
pound
those in the
cows, and they're
audience
being
unaware.
carried off by eagles. The eagle has devolved into something quite, I should say, evolved today into something quite different than it was
Mhm.
in my day. In my day, when I started to study eagles back in the 50s and 60s, we did studies about how much an eagle could carry. An adult male eagle, which of course is only 7, 8, 9 pounds. We did a study on one where I watched him catch a fish offshore. It was I'm sad to tell you how I know how much it weighed, but it weighed exactly 1 pound, 8 ounces in good old weight, American style, English style weight. And that bird could carry that fish about just above the water for about 400 yards. And then it would come down in the water. It was just too heavy for it.
Mhm.
And it would rest for 20 minutes, laying out across the water. And then it would get going and it would fly again. It would fly another 300 meters and then come down in the water again. It was just too heavy. It did this for over 2 hours and it eventually got close enough to shore that it just swam ashore, dragging the same 1.8 ounce fish. That's just about half a kilo, a little over. In fact, it's like 600, 700 grams for Canadians. That was a male eagle. And when it dragged it to shore, it kind of let the fish go up on the shoreline. And we were following it all this time in the boat. And I went in and I borrowed the fish and weighed it and measured it and took pictures of it and the whole thing. We did leave the fish for it. I have joked about having enjoyed it for dinner, but we had lots of food. I only made that story up. But the point of it is that was a male eagle, 1.5 pounds. He could not sustain carrying for very long. And he's a big, strong adult eagle, male. Female eagles, bigger, 9, 10, 14 pounds up to, they can carry about 3 pounds. So how they carry off 300 and 400 pound cows is a bit of a joke. It's really a photographic trick.
Is it really?
Oh yeah,
Oh,
yeah. I'm
okay,
sorry
okay,
about
okay.
that. I've disillusioned several people.
Okay.
Yeah, and any mother that wanted to get rid of her kids, there's no hope in it this way. I'm joking. Bad joke. Bad joke. I take that joke back.
Okay.
Anyway, the bottom line is, on those docks, I saw these buckets full of fish, and I realized that this was a big major determinant in eagle distribution because they had eliminated nesting eagles in Washington state totally. They were just gone. They'd been harvested for the bounty. Thank God that ended. That it ended the very year I discovered it. Not because I discovered it, but that was coming to an end then by chance. But thank God we've had a rethinking of killing animals for bounties. At the same time, even all through my thesis days, which was the next 10 years of timing, we in Canada were still paying a bounty on the noses of seals. We would give a $5 bounty for seal carcasses that were shot and the noses cut off and turned in for $5. I don't think we paid a bounty on orcas,
But how
we
did it
killed
come
them.
about orcas then?
Well, orcas, like
Mhm.
eagles,
Mhm.
eat protein. I mean, they eat
Sure.
fish, and so we humans always are looking for an excuse to account for our over harvest of something. So if we can blame it on an eagle or blame it on an orca, we'll do that readily. The story of the orca harvest was kind of an interesting one. I was going out to do a study. This is a bit later. I was
Mhm.
already in graduate school by this time. It was in 1964, I guess. And we had gone from Tofino, which is out on the west coast of Vancouver Island. It's now a national park. It wasn't then. And we were going out in a federal fisheries boat and just got offshore out into the open ocean. And somebody yelled, "Killer whales, killer whales." And somebody came brushing by me. I was up talking to the captain at the time because they were taking us, my wife and I, and we were going to leave us on a little remote island to study seabirds. And the fisheries boat was taking us out there. Well, at the yell of killer whales, somebody emerged with a big machine gun,
Mhm.
carrying this machine gun, mounted it on a priest turret on the front of the vessel. And then the boat turned into where the orcas were, and it was just brrrr, and they were firing these big long shells into the pod of orcas.
Wow.
That was conservation
That was
in
conservation.
the 1963. That year was 1964.
Yeah,
So
as I understand it, not only was there this sort of greedy desire of we want more fish as humans and we think that the orcas and eagles are taking it, but there was also really a almost moralistic take to it sometimes, right? Where like predators are bad and they kill like wolves kill baby, the deer and the sheep and like there's just no good comes of predators and the world would be better off without them, except for us, of course.
I was just going to say, please, you have to recorrect that, except for us. Heaven
Yeah.
forbid. Yes, you're absolutely right. Predators were getting rid of them was just a justification to the ammunition and the gun companies to sell and make a profit. And they promoted killing predators all the time. Anyway, that's what happened with that phase.
Yeah, I have to interject again because we have comments from a couple of different people on supposed footage of, baby calves and stuff like that being carried off by eagles. And so I want to say it's not just for no reason that people have these misconceptions about what eagles are capable of. One thing is that, oftentimes a calf or livestock will die of other causes and the eagles will scavenge on the carcass. They'll take advantage of something that's already dead and eat it. And so when, someone sees their animal dead and being eaten by an eagle, they kind of come to the wrong conclusion that the eagle killed the animal instead of it just happened to come across a dead animal. But now we have this kind of new insidious reason that people are being misled. And Christian, as sort of a photography
Yeah.
camera expert, could you speak to that real quick?
Yeah, I can. I actually looked at a lot of the footage very closely because I mean, I'm also interested in the technical side. Some of these things, I mean, one mentioned the baby story, which cruised around, but if you look,
Describe us for that real quick because I haven't
well,
seen any of these videos.
gosh, I saw that movie some time ago. I think it's an old movie, but there's a baby in a park, and you see an eagle coming, grabbing the baby, and flying off. Brilliant job in photo editing to such an extent. Sorry, David, just watch out.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, it's okay.
I
It's okay.
didn't realize that was your pad.
to such an extent that it fooled me even at the first time. And it's only when you look at every single frame, and there, of course, I wasn't the only one. There were some experts looking at this that you could see that there was some very careful editing going on with the with the type of animations and photo editing that you can do today, and what you see, for example, on TikTok. It's amazing what they do. So it's getting more and more difficult to actually see it, and very much people say seeing is believing, right? They see this once, and I don't blame them. And also, I mean, this by the way is a realistic scale of an eagle behind us.
It's
right?
not a realistic scale. That isn't a real eagle.
It's a real
it
eagle.
happens to have
That's
lived.
it.
I think this bird is probably about 18 years old, and
Yes.
somehow it got
And it's a
poisoned.
female, right?
And it's a female.
Yes.
And it's in the mature plumage, and it died. And the Fish and Wildlife Branch gave it to me to mount, and I have a collection of them. And we use them in educational.
Yes.
But it is a real eagle.
Yes, you can touch it, and I can turn it. For those who didn't, who thought that this was photoshopped in, this is actually real.
Yeah,
So-
bring her forward real quick if you can, not
Yes,
to
I
get
can.
too
I'll
off
move a little
topic
bit
from
aside,
faking
and
video
I'm just
footage.
going to do something that nobody believes. I'm going to bring it right forward. I should put the table up a little bit. Yeah, let me just lift it a little bit up so you can actually see it and see these beautiful
The
talons.
eagle's head is getting cut
Yeah,
off
I
somehow,
know.
Christian.
Put the head, yeah, there you are. Put the head back
Yeah,
down.
I'll put it a little bit
Yeah,
back so you
yeah.
can see it a little bit better.
There.
But you can see if I'm next to the eagle, you can see the scale is quite amazing, actually, right?
Hello.
So it's an absolute beautiful thing. And this
Rotate
actually,
her a bit, please. Yeah, show
yeah,
us.
what is interesting just to mention is you can't really have this in our house. I mean, I only have this because we're having this for educational purposes. I mean, you can say a lot more about this, David, right?
Well, the Fish
Yeah.
and Wildlife Branch controls eagles in our province,
Put her back there.
and they
Right.
give our foundation the right to have eagles, and when they're either poisoned or killed or whatever it happens to be, they're given first case. They're given to the native brand, native people to mount and use the feathers, but as a scientist and as an educator, I have access to them as well, and I have a collection of them that are mounted in different age classes, and so on. So it's a marvelous bird. And today, I mean, it's a totally different time than what we were talking about when in the 50s and 60s, when eagles were considered a pest. And they were given a bounty in some areas, like in Alaska. Today, they're all protected. Even in Alaska, they're now protected. I make sure that people understand that. And so we're very fortunate that today the eagle has had a remarkable comeback. When I started my studies in the Fraser Valley here, I had 3 pairs of bald eagles, all nesting in the Vancouver Harbor, where they had a degree of protection from being shot. And there was none in the main parts of the valley. I now have just over 600 pairs nesting in the Fraser Valley. 600 pairs. So they've had a remarkable comeback during my
And you
period of
count
studying
every
them.
single one of them, right?
I do.
Every single.
I have them, all these nests plotted out. I have 600 and
It's
well, I
amazing.
have 600 and I think it's 9 active nests. I have another 300 that have been abandoned, that are in the same territories, but they've abandoned a nest and they're actually occupying a new nest, a better, more substantial nest in a new tree. So I've got just
Yeah,
over 600
that's
nests.
it's wonderful to see, you know, just like the comeback story like that, and to hear from someone who's seen it all. Just like wrapping up in our last 10 minutes or so here, we have a question from Marie that I think is a really good one to sort of like close
Yeah.
up stuff. So we've mentioned several different threats that you saw to eagles, right? Like if we could briefly kind of recap, there was people killing them for bounties because they thought that they were eating too much fish. There's the DDT and insecticides. Now we have, you know, this heat wave problems and climate change. And yeah, and you also mentioned like big trees being not as common as they used to be. Um, could you kind of comment on all the different, you know, summarize what are all the different stressors that these eagles faced, and kind of say, you know, which one, like maybe rank them, and then also, you know, which ones are still the most concerning? What's like the biggest stressor now we have to deal with?
Sure, the eagles have to deal with, not us. It's the eagles that have to
Well,
deal with
but maybe we could help deal with some of them. You
yeah,
know, what if we could fix
you're
something?
absolutely right. Eagles, in the first place, are fish eaters. They're scavengers for half the year. They're fish eaters, catchers of fish, predominantly catchers of fish during their nesting season. They will take a variety of things. They'll take turtles, they'll occasionally take mammals or reptiles, but they're basically fish eaters, and they want fresh fish to feed their young. This is what makes them so different than our bald eagle evolved from old world vultures. And the vulture had turkey-like feet, and our eagles have gained an ability to have good grasping feet again. And so they have become predatory, but they're only predatory for half the year, and that is the nesting season. Because in the nesting season, they have to get dinner, catch it, near the nest, and that's enabled them to be able to nest over huge areas. And because they basically catch fish, they nest wherever there's fish in waters, whether it's the lakes, the creeks, rivers, the ocean, whatever. They are a riparian attracted species. They live near waterways. But they only hunt fish during half the year. The other half, they're scavengers. And because the West Coast has one of the biggest dumps of protein of any place in the world because of our salmon spawning, salmon spawn and are available as dead protein for 6 months of the year. And so our eagles live on the waste of the salmon carcasses for 6 months, and the other 6 months they're active predators. They distribute themselves over the landscape, so each one of them has its own territory and for catching its own dinner for its own young. But in the non-breeding season, the half of the year when they can be scavengers, they scavenge the carcasses of salmon, and that starts in the north. This is what is so striking about eagles. The northern rivers spawn out dead salmon starting in late June, and so June, July, and August are all the northern rivers have their spawn, and the dead salmon are all laying on the rivers. All the eagles, the northern eagles and our southern eagles, go to the north to get their first free meals. And then as the north freezes up, it gets under ice, because we're talking about the north. There can be 3 feet of ice on a lake. Well, the eagle can't hunt through ice. So as the ice moves south, the eagles move south. And there's 2 different big differences in seasons of available spawned out fish. The north is early from late June through July, August. In the south, the carcasses are available from late October, November, and December, January. So the eagles from the north move south and pick up the dead carcasses as the north is freezing up. The south begins to deliver the fresh dinners. Now, what happens is an interesting overlap here, because in the north, as the eagles come south from the north, they're living on these southern spawned out fish, which go from October, November, December, January, and occasionally into February and March. Our eagles, our southern eagles, already have their young by this time. They produce their eggs at Christmas, or their nests at Christmas. They lay their eggs in February and March and raise their young in April, May, and June. So then our southern eagles finish laying their eggs and raising their young just in time to migrate north, and the table is set in the north for them with all these dead spawned out salmon. So then they follow them back again, with the northern eagles following them back. So it's a wonderful cycle for eagles. They can actively hunt and find all sorts of variety, whatever fish are available in each local area. They can catch that for the 6 months of raising their own young, but for the other 6 months of the year, they scavenge the carcasses of salmon. That doesn't mean they won't scavenge a carcass of a dead seal or anything else that washes up on the beaches. They will. And in more recent times, kind of negatively, but they also scavenge the gut piles from dead hunted deer and elk and moose and so on, which unfortunately often has lead in it from the shot, and so a lot of eagles die from lead poisoning, which is an unfortunate thing of how we shoot eagles, or how we shoot our game in this country with lead shot. And we're trying to condition hunters to not use lead shot because it's so toxic. Using steel shot kills the animals, but it doesn't re-kill the eagles when they ingest it, where lead shot kills every eagle. It's just a pellet in the food and the eagle is dead. It's quite alarming.
Yeah, that's
Wow,
that side. Oh,
that's
sorry.
terrible.
Yeah, so that's that side.
Yeah, so
Go on. Go on.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah. So if I could just kind of summarize what I think what I think your summary would be, and then you can correct me. I'm sure you'll have corrections, David. It sounds like, threats to bald eagles, things that negatively impact them by humans, are kind of many, many fold, right? There's this like there's chemicals like lead and DDT, and there's climate change risks like the heat wave they're facing now, and also any factors that affect the salmon. Just sort of general. Oop, my internet is saying my connection is Dave. But yeah, factors that affect the salmon, like heat, the streams heating up too much or something like that. Anything that affects salmon is going to be really bad for eagles out west, at least. But so it sounds like there's many, many different threats, but that we've seen at least kind of the removal of two big ones that allowed for population recovery, which was the removal of the bounty, where they were getting paid for eagle talons, and the ceasing of the DDT chemical. Would you say that those are the two big things that have allowed eagles to recover, but now there's still all these like other ongoing threats, and some that are potentially going to swoop up and catch us off guard, like climate shifting?
Yeah, you've got that really right on. There's another big kind of pervasive challenge for eagles, and that is in areas where humans are also relatively common, and unfortunately wherever there's waterways we tend to accumulate. Well, of course, the bald eagle is a riparian eagle. It makes its living predominantly from fish eating, and so it follows the rivers. So a big challenge that's on top of the things you talked about is that where we go, we tend to cut down the damn trees. And so all the big trees in the areas of human exploitation have largely been removed. We're in one of the world's most productive regions, right here in British Columbia, has the highest density of breeding eagles, probably did pre-white man, and is getting back to having the highest density of breeding eagles again. But the challenge for the eagles is not that there's a lack of food here. There's huge amounts of food in our productive sea. The challenge has been we've cut down all the nest trees, and so there's miles and miles of wonderful shoreline, and normally eagles always nest within 30-50 feet of the shoreline, because that's where their food is coming. It's always coming out of the sea, or the river, or the ditches, and so as we move in, humans move in, we tend to cut down the trees. Hey, we use them for lumber, but sometimes they're just plainly in the road. We can't have the nice view. And so the big negative thing for eagles in the greater British Columbia, or at least the greater Fraser Valley area where we are here, is the fact that humans have cut down most of the big nest trees. And so eagles are nesting. Well, we even had one a couple of years ago that nested on the ground because that didn't last for very long because it was disturbed so many times. But they want to be up 70, 80, 90 feet. And if they can get up 100 feet in a really big tree, they're really feeling secure. They're out of the way of barking dogs and forever walking people, because they'll nest right above a parkway and a roadway and in people's backyards if they can get up above the disturbance level. So the big challenge today is of course the pesticide. It's lead from shot,
Roadkill.
So roadkill itself is a good food source because lots of animals are killed on the road. But the problem is an eagle comes down onto the road to eat the dead animal, and then it gets hit by a car. So it becomes the second road kill from the same incident.
Yeah,
But the big challenge
as I understand, this is a problem for a number of raptors.
Yes. And the big challenge at the moment in the built up areas is the lack of big trees. Getting a tree big enough to get that nest up 60, 70, 80, 100 feet above the ground.
Well, then we were in the Aleutian Islands where there are no trees, right?
Right, and they were nesting on the cliffs,
Yes,
but there's no people on those cliffs.
Yeah,
that's the difference.
There's
just no people on the cliffs.
So, Christian, I know that you mentioned the trees are maybe cut down for lumber, but could also potentially be cut down for other reasons, of course. Is there like lumber we should avoid buying if possible, like from particular locations or particular tree species that they prefer?
No, I mean, you could say lumber that is wood, but I'm just joking because I mean, all different types of lumber is used for so many different things. I mean, the paper is the
Of course.
is the biggest user of lumber in this day and age, is making paper
Mhm.
from trees, and so we've greatly reduced the big trees that were available. They're simply used, and it takes 100 to 300 years or 500 years to produce a really big tree. They can grow a tree in 50, 60 years, but it's not as big. And what we've learned about trees is that, contrary to the logging instructions or their propaganda in the early years, trees are more productive in the early years of their life. They produce more wood in the first 50 years than they do thereafter. That's proven to be quite wrong. The biggest trees that produce the most additional wood per year are the ones that are already 200 years or 300 years old. So it's hard to, you can't have all of our big trees. We need to have space and we need the lumber and so on. But we could get back to a kind of more responsible attitude, or saving some of these big trees that are in parks and putting them back again. I mean, that's, we could do a whole programs on this, because one of the things that we've specialized in the last few years is building eagle nests. I build them all the time. I worked with one of my helpers yesterday and the day before, lining a new eagle's nest that we're going to put up. And so we build eagle's nests for the eagles, and we build great nests. I mean, our nest will last them 40, 50 years. Now, often there will be wild nests that will last that long. Sometimes maybe hundreds of years. But most trees don't last that long once they've got a nest in them. The limbs die, and the eagle nest eventually breaks that limb off and falls. But building eagle nests is a thing that we've specialized in to try and get these birds back to nesting in city parks and so on. And it's incredibly successful. We literally, if we get to determine when we can build and erect the nest, we've got almost 100%. Well, we have 100% success in the nest that we build.
And you
They
have
get
this, and
occupied
you
by
have
eagles.
and you have this wonderful mitigation program, right?
Yes, the province of
Mhm.
British Columbia
Mhm.
has been a world leader in this. They have said enough is enough. We can't just keep cutting down every big tree and with every eagle's nest in it. And so they now have put in laws, and they've been on the books for 50 years, but they're now enforcing them. A law is a law, but it's only meaningful if you enforce it. And so now we've talked them into enforcing this. And so the last number of years, every eagle's nest that is in the road of development, they have to do what we call a mitigation plan. And we come up with a plan that says, if that nest is there and it's in the road, we can move it just over there and build a new one in that tree, and the eagles will continue to nest, and then your people in that building can look out at it and they'll still be able to see it. And so we've been incredibly successful in simply building new nest sites for these eagles.
Mhm.
Well, David, that is absolutely amazing. It's great to hear. That's just another positive aspect in addition to the eagle recovery that you've brought to our attention on the show today. Um, so, I just want to say, David, thank you so much for sharing your stories of your conservation perspective over the years, and also stories from your life. How can people help out? Are they able to donate to your society if they want to help to put some of these eagle nests out there, or give us a few closing comments on what we can do?
Sure. Well, we have the Hancock Wildlife Foundation, and it has pioneered a lot of these things. It pioneered putting cameras in eagles' nests to let the world understand them. It's pioneered to a large extent. By no means the only place, but we're one of the places really focused on how to give the eagles a new nest site. If their nest is in the road of developers, we'll just figure out how to move it. You can carry on with your development, but we'll build you a new nest. And the government is now a really interesting program. If you're going to disturb or move a nest or destroy it, you have to build 3 of them, or we have to build 3 of them to replace the one you're destroying. So we're actually using this law to get more eagles into this environment in the areas that have just lost all the nest trees. I mean, that's the challenge here. It's not that there's a lack of food. There's a lot of food for eagles in this area, probably more today than there was 400 years ago before white people came here. There's more food in the lower Fraser Valley because of all the ditches and so on, as well as the intertidal beach zones of the ocean, which is, of course, the most productive areas. So the big challenge becomes giving them a big enough tree that they can hang that nest 70, 80 feet up in the air, and that nest can weigh 2, 3, 4, 500 pounds. Or if there are no trees left, well, that's what I was working on yesterday and the day. We have a pole that's going to go in, and we have a big aluminum nest that's built on the top of it, and then we line it all with wood for them. And it has about 250 pounds of wood inside the aluminum frame. And so we build them a nice nest, and that nest will probably last them, it may last 60, 70 years. I mean, the first 2 or 3 we built, the nest is still there, but we didn't fix in, because we didn't know that yet. We didn't fix in the big branches adequately. And somehow when they rot, other creatures came and borrowed all those twigs and the sticks from the nest. So now we've learned to really fix these nests in so that nobody else can steal the branches. I mean, cormorants or crows or ravens, they want to borrow the branches and take them somewhere else. Well, we have to guard against that. And now every nest that we built is basically reused or is used by the eagles.
I love that. That's so interesting. They want to borrow the branches. Well, yeah, thank you so much, David, for joining us and telling us all about eagles. We have a lot of comments about thanking you for sharing all your eagle knowledge with us. And I love it. There's a lot of parallels that I see as a bat biologist. I see a lot of parallels with putting up bat boxes, bat houses. Sometimes you put them on a dead tree. Sometimes you put them on a big pole. You make them so they last longer than the tree normally would.
Exactly.
But yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. And Christian, and also we put the link to your Society to Hancock Wildlife Foundation.
Well,
it's in
that's
there.
what I was trying to say, and I always get distracted when I'm trying to raise funds.
Yeah, David doesn't. Let me talk about funds.
All right. Well, you raise funds for us. We definitely need them, but I'm never good at raising.
He hates this, but I really can tell you, David's a very modest person. He's got a wonderful foundation. I mean, I've seen it for over 10 years now, the way David works. I really can tell you, every time I come to his house, the amount of energy that David does in the restoration of eagle nests, to count them, to care for eagles, is just, it's unheard of. Those of you who know David will know he is really the person that you see here. And the foundation does need funds. It does. He won't like to talk about it, but I'm telling you, they do need funds, because putting up eagle nests is horrendously expensive. They have to hire a crane, personnel, and so on. And this is all really for the love of nature. And unfortunately, there are no funds available for that publicly. So any type of donation that you can find to the link is most welcome. So.
Well, thank you for saying that. There's no doubt about it. We can always use the funds. I mean, we could use several millions of dollars to build a big new raptor center, which is really what we want to do. But that's another challenge.
Okay. Yeah, that's another challenge. And Georgia, thank you so much for leading the interview. That was really marvelous. It's wonderfully done.
Oh, well, it was an easy interview to lead. So yeah, with that, we will all say goodbye, and you can join us next week at this time. Me and Christian will be here with another humans and wildlife topic. In the meantime,
tomorrow.
Please. Please. So next week will be another humans and wildlife show at this time. Please like and subscribe to both of us, or whatever platform you're viewing on. We appreciate you all so much for joining us. And if you have some of the comments from Facebook or other platforms outside of HAPS, you might not be able to see our responses to you, so we'll go back and check those and add some responses. But we really appreciate each and every one of you joining. And we also, as Christian was just letting me not forget, we also are going to be doing a special broadcast tomorrow with a group of, with a group of native artists, and they're going to be drawing some eagle pictures. It's a group that gets together and draws each week, and they're going to be drawing eagles tomorrow alongside me and Christian. So please join us for that if that sounds interesting to you. Any closing comments, Christian?
That's it. You said it well. Thank you very much. And thanks to David.
Thank you guys for bringing more attention to eagles. They're a dominant force in our ecosystem, and they're just a beautiful contribution. And what is so wonderful, I have seen this come the whole shift from being a despised predator to now being an icon of conservation. And that's all about how humans have changed their attitude toward these predators. And it's kind of rewarding. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, David. Bye, everybody.